Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, buenas tardes. Welcome to today's See Common Ground talk, Embracing Multilingualism, a conversation on policy and practice. My name is Claudia Quintero, and I'm Senior Director and one of the co-founders here at See Common Ground. I'm delighted to be moderating today's discussion on multilingualism, especially because being bilingual myself, I know it has opened so many doors for me, doors to new experiences, continuous opportunities, deeper empathy, and meaningful connections. For those new to See Common Ground talks, welcome. See Common Ground provides statewide and community-facing organizations with funding, a supportive and well-managed learning community, and access to expertise to bring about the sustainable change that matters most to their community. Through our collaboration networks and action accelerators, See Common Ground provides those supports to organizations and their leaders to connect with their peers and participate in leadership development to better meet the needs of their community. As we engage in today's discussion, please submit any questions you have for our panel using the Q&A function. And just like all of our talks at See Common Ground, the session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel by the end of this week. So today's conversation will center on the importance and benefit of honoring the home languages of students and their families, as well as the policies and practices that support emerging multilingual learners in the United States. According to the U.S. Department of Education's Raise the Bar, Lead the World call to action, more than 5 million English language learners have enrolled in public elementary and secondary schools, comprising about 10% of the student population since 2019. This number continues to grow, and even though not all immigrants are English language learners and not all English language learners are immigrants, there is significant overlap in our work, which, along with the rising attention and promotion of multilingualism, really encouraged us to host this talk today with our esteemed panelists. So on our panel today, we have Dr. Stephany Cuevas, Assistant Professor of Education at the Attallah College of Educational Studies at Chapman University, Leslie Villegas, Senior Policy Analyst for Education Policy at New America, and Leiataua Dr. John Peterson, Senior Policy Fellow and Long-Term Consultant at Minnesota Education Equity Partnership. And John is also part of See Common Ground's Immigration is American Collaboration Network, which is one of our networks of organizations across the country who support immigrant and refugee students and families as they navigate the education system here in the United States. So to start off the panel today, I'd just love to ask each of you to introduce yourselves, share a little bit about your background, and share with us why you think or why multilingualism matters to you. Dr. Cuevas, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, good afternoon / morning. I am zooming in from California, where we're Pacific time. It's still early, it's still morning. And so as Claudia mentioned, I am a faculty member at Chapman University, but my area of expertise and my research really focuses on family engagement. So how do families in schools and communities work together to support our students' well-being? Particularly, I focus on the experiences of Latinx communities. So within that, due to histories of migration and just different contexts, a lot of the populations that I work with are both immigrant and also multilingual. So that is kind of my background and approach. And why is multilingualism important to me? I'm bilingual. I am product of I like to say I'm a live experiment of what happens when language policies happen. So when I was in primary school, shifting from kindergarten to first grade, California passed a policy that I was in bilingual ed, so I was in Spanish and English instruction, and then shifting to first grade, I went English only, and really seeing that disconnect between languages. I come from a Mexican immigrant family where we only spoke Spanish in the house, so having to adjust my own schooling to the language, I struggled a bit, and it was interesting to see how my sisters also, who are younger, also had their own impact. So multilingualism, bilingual, and just supporting our students and families, it's a topic that is not only very personal, but also something that I'm very dedicated because it's part of who I am. So I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Leslie, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Leslie Villegas. I'm a senior policy analyst at New America, where I focus on state and national education policy that pertains to students identified as English learners. I was born in Mexico and grew up in California, and my journey to this work comes from my personal experiences also being educated in California before and after Prop 227. And I didn't know it then, but I was extremely lucky to have access to bilingual education, especially in those early years. I was fluent in Spanish and English by the time I was 7, and luckily didn't face many barriers in my K through 12 educational experience. And over time, maintaining my home language in an English dominant world has been difficult, but these early years had a significant impact on me. And unfortunately, I've seen the effects that exclusionary and racist language policies have had on generations that came after me. And our team is dedicated to changing this policy landscape.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And John?
Hey, Attallah. My name's Leiataua, Dr. John Peterson. I am with the Minnesota Education Equity Partnership, and I work there as the Senior Policy Fellow and Long-Term Consultant. I've been an educator since 1999. My background is in teaching in the classroom and also as an administrator. Multilingualism matters to me both for personal and professional reasons. On the professional side, I studied abroad in Spain for a year back in 1995 and 96, and ended up teaching Spanish to 7th and 8th graders for a number of years as an instructor. And so just seeing language become such an important part of the learning experience really has driven a passion for me as a professional. I'm also interested in shifting policies and practices and procedures as it relates to state legislation relative to multilingual learners. At a personal level, I come from a mixed multilingual family. I have 16 brothers and sisters. Some of them speak Spanish and some of them speak Samoan, which is where I am originally from. And so I've just seen on the personal side how rich the environment can be on the positive aspects of having a multilingual, multicultural family. So I'm really pleased to be here today and looking forward to the conversation, both listening and sharing.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for sharing both your professional and your personal experiences with multilingualism and language policy. And I'd love to just kind of kick off this panel conversation with a couple of questions I have, but just as a friendly reminder to our audience, if you have any questions throughout this conversation, go ahead and throw them into the Q&A box and I'll incorporate them throughout the conversation as well. But as you know, each of you kind of mentioned the importance of the language that's spoken at home. And then as we transition into school, maybe that's the same language and maybe that's a very different language. And we encounter, multiple languages potentially in our home as well. But just wanted to start with you, Dr. Cuevas, around what that means for learning environments. And, maybe talk a little bit about what are some of the ways that we can best hold space for students and families and educators to both speak and hear multiple languages as folks are on this multilingualism journey, going from maybe one language to 2 or 3 in different cases. So yeah, how do we kind of hold space for that in school communities so everybody can learn and engage comfortably with each other?
Yeah, I think one of the elements that I think we have decades of research that really shows that there needs to be a connection between the home and the school space, right? So just that connection, not only in terms of language, but also in terms of culture and understanding what are the knowledges and assets and gifts that are found within our home communities, our homes, our communities, and how they can be elevated in our schools, right? So language is one of them, right? Language is really much connected to a culture and the way that we understand even like nuances between like slang words, right? And understanding those things and how they represent who we are and where we come from. So I think that that's one of the reasons why students whose home languages and / cultures, I would argue, whose are honored in the school benefit from that, right? Like they're academically, social-emotional, they receive those benefits. And unfortunately, we are in an educational context where that is often not the case for all our students, right? We live in a multilingual world that wants to be monolingual, and that's not a reality, right? So I think that we can create spaces for multilingualism if we really strip it down and respect one another. And what I mean by that, I think something that, again, I come from a family engagement scholarship where relationships are really at the core of making things better in our schools. And part of those relationships is really having mutual respect for each other, even across differences, and seeing each other as human beings. Because yes, I can sit here and tell you, please have all documents in multiple languages, have translators available. But if we don't respect and see each other as humans, that is not gonna work, right? So I think one of the bigger barriers that I've experienced in working with schools are, again, around family engagement, it's particularly in overcoming language barriers, is really like, what are the mindsets that educators have of families, and what are the mindsets and perceptions, assumptions that families have of educators, right? So I think it goes both ways. And I think it really gets stripped down to respect, and when you have respect for another, right, I'm gonna make sure that I have translators available. I'm gonna make sure that the documents that we translate are appropriate, right, that they're culturally relevant. I've worked with families, and again, most of my work is with Spanish speaking parents, and they tell me, right, we can tell when people just take things onto Google Translate and just spit out and copy paste whatever that gives us, right? Some of that Google Translate uses big words that are not appropriate for a particular context, right? But again, if you go down to respect and really seeing your communities as equals, as partners, even if there's language barriers, you will find ways to overcome them. I have a quick example. One of the organizations that I'm currently working with is called Soccer Without Borders. And for them, they really focus on working with immigrant and refugee youth. And they use soccer as an approach to that, right? Like, and it's interesting because the coaches are like, we don't speak the different languages, right? We don't speak but the way that we approach them is like, they all speak soccer. And I'm sitting there like, well, when you have to coach them, how do you even do it? They're like, no, like in soccer, like these students know that we care for them, that we value them, that we respect them. They're gonna keep coming to us, and we figure out with like, you know, soccer is a universal language and we can speak that, right? But I think at the core is that our students feel seen, they feel cared for, and they feel respected, right? So that is even able to overcome some of those challenges that language barriers may cause. So respect and relationships is gonna be probably my answer to all your questions.
Excellent. I appreciate the preview, but also that example. And I just love what you said too about soccer being a universal language. And, you know, I think we've seen that also with music, you know, being a universal language that can bring people and communities and cultures together across difference, as well as food. So I think just appreciate your expansive definition of what languages we're talking about here as well. And I think just to pick up on your point about relationships and, you know, like you said, a lot of tech tools to help be able to translate. And yet sometimes, you know, that could mean also create more confusion. So to your point, there could be big words, or just poorly translated materials can actually be quite confusing. And, you know, we have different literacy levels too of families, even in their home language, depending on how much schooling they've had in their home country. So just curious about maybe digging a little bit deeper into the relationship piece. Of maybe some examples how you've seen school districts or schools maybe leverage some of those relationships between educators and families, or even students who are learning English and translating back to their parents, or, you know, just maybe some of those examples of how relationships can really be a piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, right? I think a lot, and language barriers is often one of the challenges that schools face. And when I go back to like, okay, definitely we would want multilingual teachers. We want multilingual office staff, right? We would want multilingual teachers aid. And the reality of our schools and the way that capitalism and budgets work, we don't have that, right? But I think that if you have strong relationship with schools, again, both from personal experiences, but also from research, right? Once you have relationships with families with community members, they become your strongest assets and advocates. So there you may have family members, parents, aunties, grandparents, retired grandparents, right, that are fluent in both languages, that are willing to volunteer to be translators, right, as possible, right? So that's when you have what sociologists call our human capital. But that's just tapping into that, right? Also our students, right? And again, and empowering them to see translation as a skill that they can develop. And again, because a lot of our schools are often framed, depending on the context, but often framed, knowing another language can be seen as shameful because you're not fluent in one of them or the other. But encourage them, like, it can be a practice, right? So we all have heard stories of like a student being the one that translates and they're like totally lying. So how do we shift the culture within schools to like make sure that that doesn't happen, right? So again, it goes back to trust and relationships. So definitely tapping into your people that you have. Also, it really comes down to school leaders, right? Principals, who are the ones that are making budget decisions. Maybe your priority is to hire front office personnel who speak the other language that's dominant in your school context, right? Maybe it's not, maybe you can hire all multilingual teachers, but you can have an office staff member who's the one that's welcoming families into the school building, right? So who are the ones that families see? And another thing is like really technology, right? I think I keep saying that one of the silver linings of the pandemic was that a lot of communities and families, even though unwillingly sometimes, got used to the use of technology and how do we even use that. For example, I have now educators who are like, I want to talk to a parent. We somehow use sign language pictures to relate to one another, but then they feel comfortable with me using like a Google Translate, like, oh, give me a word and I will give you what it means, right? So even something that I've seen, and I'm thinking I should do a study on this, but something that I've seen is that technology, the more that there is trust between people that don't speak the same language, they then feel comfortable using and they trust that they're going to use technology to help them communicate. So that's been something interesting to see how, okay, I'm going to be patient with you as you're grabbing your phone, translating, okay, this is what I mean, right? So I think that that's something that schools can really tap into while we work on making sure that our teachers, counselors are all multilingual. So that's a separate project.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that example too of when there might be appropriate situations and how tools can be used in different ways. And like you said, having that base understanding of respect, but also patience, because I think a lot of this in practice takes time, and it's not just going to be business as usual, and that's okay, and that there's actually going to be more understanding if we just take a little bit of time to really try to understand each other. So and I think one thing that you mentioned too was that piece around shame, maybe some of the, oh, I should know this, I don't know this, and I think that's the other question I wanted to ask you around, the perceptions and mindsets around learning or knowing other languages other than English. And so just would love to hear, your thoughts on what some of those like positive messages are around multilingualism, but also maybe some of the negative stigmas or assumptions that we have from society, schools, or even the home environment of what it means to speak a language other than English, and how that might impact even the identity development of multilingual learners.
I'm gonna try to give you the short version of that because we have generations of books and classes and scholarship and anecdotes about this. So I think something that's been very interesting to see, and again, I'm in California, is this immersion of dual immersion schools, right? So it's schools that often, and here in Southern California, it's often English and Spanish instruction, right? So for me, it's been really interesting to go into those schools and see who the student population is. Half of those students are often non-Latino, often white, affluent students. And then the other half are Latino, Latinx students from immigrant household that speak Spanish at home, right? So I think it's been an interesting dynamic to see how even educators respond to these different populations of students. For the white students, for the non-Spanish speaking students that don't speak Spanish at home, those schools are framed as like, oh, we're going to prepare you for a multicultural, diverse world. It's going to be helpful for you in the future. You want to learn a different language. And then for the Spanish speaking students from Spanish speaking backgrounds, it's like, we're going to help you improve not only your Spanish, but also your English, making the assumption that English is not spoken in the house, right? So it's an interesting dynamic where it's just like the reasonings why, and again, it may vary by families, it may vary by context, but why these students are getting enrolled in these schools is interesting to see just the dynamics that happen. So something that, as you were saying, right, one of the positive, right, like again, the earlier we get our babies learning multiple languages, one, is easier for them to retain. I was trying to learn French and I was like, I gave up in college. I was like, nope, even though it's very close to Spanish, my brain was not cognitive there. But again, it does have a positive impact on cognitive development. And it also does prepare students for our global economy, right? So if you want to be marketable in the job market, it does help to know multiple languages. But I think something that we have seen over generations is what are, like you said, what are the assumptions that people make about English language learners, right? Or like bilingual students, right? So again, it's also very racialized, right? So we make the assumptions that you phenotypically look a certain way, you have an accent, English is your second language, right? So or even if you learn both languages at the same time, making the assumption like, oh, you're brown, you must be Latino, you must be, you know, Spanish is your first language. Sometimes it's not even Spanish, maybe it's an indigenous language, right? So I think that those are some of the assumptions that we make. And because the reality is that we really live in a very racist, racialized world, there comes assumptions based on where I think you're come from, right? And research shows that teachers, for example, often assume that their students whose English is their second language, they assume that they have lower academic abilities, which is just not true, that they're just not able to translate. That's not the case, right? So we've seen that those assumptions being made about quote unquote English language learners or their family that being quote dumber, or not being able to keep up with like quote unquote the regular classic English speaking class. So I think that those are some of the dynamics that you've seen. And you're also seeing, again, it's been interesting to see also how that then influences identity, like you mentioned, right? And belonging. I think right now it's been interesting on the internet, on the social media world, there's this whole concept of like the no sabo kid, who are children from Spanish speaking families, but that didn't really grow up learning Spanish, and they're seen less Latino because they don't know the language, right? And how that may impact their identity. Like I mentioned before, language and culture are very much tied in our understanding, and something that has been interesting, like now these young people are pushing back. They're like, it's not my fault that I didn't learn Spanish, but I'm just as Latino as the next one, right? And again, that comes from a history where like their families, their grandparents may have been punished in schools for speaking Spanish, right? So like now it's an interesting dynamic coming up with that. Like now as a society, most of us accept multilingualism or bilingualism, but like now they're not fitting in that space, right? So I think it's been an interesting dynamic that really does impact how they see themselves.
Thank you. I know I had a lot in that question and you touched on everything. And I just really appreciate that example too of the no sabo kids, and to what a few of you said originally in your introductions too, is like what the impact of that, you know, those policies and practices have is not just in that student, it's also down the line and generationally speaking of what is seen as a value, as an asset, but then also what might be carried on or not to future generations. So I just really appreciate those examples and, you know, speaking to the practice side, what this looks like in terms of family engagement and what it means for students. And I just think the piece you mentioned too about language and culture being a part of how we all form our identity and what that means for belonging kind of cuts across all languages and cultures too. So thank you so much. And I'd love to turn to Leslie now for a little bit about the policy piece and how it connects to just what we were just talking about, kind of what this messaging is around multilingualism. And we know there's, of course, federal civil rights that protect English language learners and what services and access they have to education and English language instruction. So I'm curious if you could share a little bit about what those civil rights are, what's kind of required, but then also how you're seeing how that intersects with, this asset-based frame of multilingualism right now in the current environment.
Sure, yeah. So it's going to get a little bit wonky at the moment for a second. But the protections and processes and services that are offered to immigrant and English learner students are enshrined in various laws. First, the Lau versus Nichols case in 1974 prohibits public schools from discriminating based on race, color, national origin, and enshrines that English learners must be provided the necessary services to, fully participate in their education, regardless of language barriers. Then through Plyler versus Doe in 1982, the Supreme Court held that federal law ensures that all students are provided with equal access to public education, regardless of immigration status. So schools and districts are precluded from asking about a student's immigration status upon enrollment. And then most recently, the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA as it's widely known, which was the most recent reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, implemented various accountability measures for English learners. Among these, the requirement that states adopt standardized entrance and exit procedures for students classified as ELs, and the requirement that states must ensure that these students are assessed within 30 days, so within a timely manner, to figure out if they do require additional language development services. And so, that's kind of like the civil rights background of it. And on the value of multilingualism and like what we're seeing today, I think we need to acknowledge that there are definitely double standards about the value of speaking a language other than English for immigrant origin kids and families compared to English dominant people. So I think that, it is nice to see it in the mainstream, but it is important to acknowledge that. And we see this in the way that speaking a language other than English among students identified as ELs in the classroom is looked at as a burden or like a barrier to their education versus kind of the neoliberal case for multilingualism, which is that which is being made for everybody else, really, where speaking more than one language is considered an economic benefit and a positive thing. And like Stephany was talking about, this is a good example of this double standard is in the fact that students identified as ELs are enrolled in dual language programs at lower rates. So in 2019-20, only about 8% were enrolled in dual language immersion programs. And so that makes you think about who are the rest of those students in those programs benefiting from these linguistic services, right? And often the languages offered in these programs don't necessarily match the most prominent languages spoken by the EL population in a given community, which, as we know, are becoming much more diverse. And somehow, like Stephany was talking about, the messaging to these families is that English is the only language that matters, whereas everybody else is being told a different thing. So I think it's important to kind of investigate that and be critical about why that's happening. And so within these multilingualism for all conversations, we need to make sure that the paradigm shift, which is very needed in our education system, includes those students who have been identified as English learners so that they don't get further left behind. And then that they're provided the services they need to go on to college or career or whatever it is that they wish to do. And so in our work, we really tried to, we've heard that this really starts with creating a culture where the responsibility, quote, responsibility for these students is shared among all teachers, not just the, EL teacher, which is what we usually hear. And that really starts with making sure that all teachers understand how to support these students. A recent report from the National Research and Development Center in Oregon found that students identified as ELs are more likely to be enrolled in academic content classes when their teachers had been trained on how to support them, which doesn't sound like super groundbreaking, but it is important to have that kind of concrete in research. And I think Stephany was talking about, the home language should also be used as an asset both in English acquisition and academic content rather than being seen as a barrier, which is what we usually see.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for covering both kind of what could be seen as the floor of what we should provide for ELs, and then also just the current kind of double standard that's being seen. I appreciate the statistic too about how little enrollment there is, and that connection point too of what is or is not aligning in terms of what the dual language is, and how that relates to the community or not. And I think, on the dual language program or the Seals of Biliteracy efforts as well, are there any bright spots in policies that you do see that are promoting multilingualism, whether at the national, state, or local level, that do actually kind of try to balance this support for English learners that are already well positioned to be multilingual, and also, think about maybe other potential students also having access to multiple languages. But yeah, anything around assessments or instruction or any other kind of policies you're seeing that are proving to be promising?
That's a very hard question to answer because we have like 52 different education systems, right? So the education that an English learner has access to differs from state to state, sometimes within district to district. So within our work, we try to ensure that these students are incorporated into those policy frameworks wherever possible. And so we focus on broadly accountability, data collection, assessment, and funding, because we feel like those are like the big policy levers that exist for these students. And for us, it's important that these policies recognize the diversity of students identified as ELs, because usually, there's a one size fits all approach, and we know that this is a very diverse group of students. So making sure that the policy reflects that from pre-K all the way through graduation and then college and career. And so on the accountability, to answer your question, not that many promising practices. But we have been talking about, on the accountability and data side, how it is very important that we improve the transparency and accountability for those different subtypes of students identified as ELs, by requiring states to disaggregate that big group, because so much is hiding underneath that like broad umbrella, and making sure that we're accounting for students with intersectional identities, including those with disabilities, students with limited or interrupted schooling, recently arrived English learners or newcomers, as they're often talked about, and then long-term English learners. So those are kids that have not been reclassified after 6-7 years as receiving services. And within this kind of accountability and data, it's also crucial that we define and incorporate that long-term EL subgroup into those systems, because up until recently, it was like an unknown phenomenon that was happening in our schools, but it's a very widely known issue, and that is really a systemic failure that has led to the creation of that group. I also try to remind people that the current EL data point only shows about half of the picture of our linguistically diverse kids in the K through 12 education system. And it's important that we increase the state, district, and school accountability for former English learners, because you don't stop being a language learner after you're reclassified, right? Like, you hopefully are continuing to build proficiency and literacy in both languages. And it's important to understand how kind of that other half of the population is doing. And so on another thing on kind of policy-wise that we focus on is considering the entire policy ecosystem that affects these students. and trying to identify where there's like contradicting policies that might be counteracting each other. And a good example of that is Arizona, which he brought up the seal of biliteracy. And they technically have this on the books, but on the other side, we're also seeing that they're trying to eliminate dual language for English learners. And so you're talking, who is going to have access to the seal of biliteracy if the students who would benefit the most are not going to have access to dual language programs? And so trying to identify kind of like those nuances in policy and making sure that there is more alignment in favor of these students. And then I just wanted to touch on funding, because we know that access and quality of education for these students always comes down to how much money is available. And broadly speaking, we know that the current levels are not enough, but because education is primarily funded through state and local dollars, we don't really know what would be enough. And so it's really, there's a lot of work to be done about how to improve all of these funding, state, federal, and local funding structures to better account for these students.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think those are really good things to keep in mind. And what you were saying too about even that the data that we do have is really just 50% of the picture is pretty sobering. And I think not only the promising practices and what would be helpful and how we think about multilingual learners in the future, but also when things don't quite make sense and don't quite align. So I just appreciate you bringing up all of those factors. And I'd love to switch over to John to go a little bit into a state example that kind of ties in, I think, a lot of what you just talked about, Leslie, but also I think as your background, John, in terms of policy and advocacy, but also as an educator and being in the classroom, that blend of both the policy and practice and what that's looked like in your work, but especially as it relates to the LEAPS Act in Minnesota and also the Emerging Multilingual Network that you run. So I just, would love to hear you kind of share a little bit about what this looks like in practice in Minnesota.
Sounds good. Thanks, Claudia. Well, let's start with the LEAPS Act from 2014, which was progressive legislation, comprehensive legislation that was paired with ESSA and with what we call the World's Best Workforce State Policy Framework. LEAPS is an acronym that stands for Learning English for Academic Proficiency and Success. It was co-authored by then Representative Carlos Mariani Rosa, who was in the Minnesota House for 32 years, and then Senator Patricia Torres Rey, who was in the Senate for about 15, 20 years in Minnesota. There are four key provisions that relate to the LEAPS Act. I'm going to read these just because I want to make sure that I communicate them succinctly, but also accurately. The first key provision is that multilingualism and multiculturalism are positioned in Minnesota state law as educational and economic assets. The second is that teachers and administrators receive the appropriate preparation and continued professional development to support multilingual learners. The third is that instruction is differentiated for the diversity of multilingual learners, both in the classroom and in out-of-school time. And then the fourth is multicultural family voices are engaged and included in the educational process. One of the challenging aspects of the LEAPS Act was that it was, for political reasons, the bill was passed, but it appears in 42 different statutes across Minnesota legislation and law. And so it can be relatively complex putting together those 42 different pieces in a way that is both succinct and meaningful for local education agencies like public charters, school districts, public schools, even private schools to implement the act. So that's a little bit about the LEAPS Act. The Emerging Multilingual Learners Network was built or created by the Minnesota Education Equity Partnership back in 2018 as a vehicle and a space to advance and push forward the legislation that was laid out in the LEAPS Act. And so we're a statewide network made up of folks from K-12, higher education, of course, the community, parents, family members, faculty and staff across the board. and we work to advocate for multilingual learners and multilingualism as an asset, multiculturalism as an asset in Minnesota. One of the aspects that we've really focused in on over the last 4.5 years is building out a policy advocacy agenda relative to multilingual learners and their families. And so we've been able to partner with various state agencies, associations like Mini TESOL, national level organizations like Seek Common Ground, Migration Policy Institute, Unidos US, and other organizations to build this agenda and really push forward for reform as it relates to funding of ELs, which is a huge issue here in Minnesota, as well as the policy frameworks that are used to better implement the LEAPS Act. One of the issues we've had in Minnesota is that there was not an adequate amount of funding provided to the Minnesota Department of Education to provide the support and the accountability. Support and accountability are both needed for healthy relationships to the local education agencies. Minnesota is very much a local control state. Property taxes make up a big proportion, along with state budget, to support learning for all students. And we get some pretty intense conversations between the state and local education agencies about who has the authority and control over how multilingual learners are going to be supported and educated. We also have a professional educator licensing and standards board called PELSB, and they are the ones who license emerging multilingual learner teachers or EL teachers, ESL teachers. Another provision that came out of the LEAPS Act is cultural competency, which is a bit of a misnomer. We know that cultural competency is you're never really truly competent in culture, constantly learning. But one of the caveats to the LEAPS Act was this piece around cultural competency being a requirement for all teachers to renew their teachers' licenses. So we have had some movement and progress, but there's also this movement in Minnesota to go to English only. It is very, how can I put it? It's discreet at times, and it's funneled through, and I don't want to get too controversial here, but structured literacy and the science of reading have been very popular here in Minnesota in the last couple of years. In fact, there was an act called the READ Act that was passed this last session. And we've noticed that there have been some repealers in the policy language relative to LEAPS that have stated that it's okay for school districts to administer assessments for language in English only, and not administer those assessments in multiple languages, as one example. So that's a little bit on the background of LEAPS and the Emerging Multilingual Learners Network. Yeah, so that would be kind of my initial response to your question.
Yeah, no, thank you for both sides of the act itself, but then also what the network is working on. And I think, as you were mentioning, as there might be threats to some things that might be sprinkled around in different statutes, that keeping an eye on what might be reversed is also sounds like a critical piece of the network's work as well. And I know you mentioned quite a few challenges and issues with its implementation. I know, Leslie, you brought up funding as well, but I'm just curious if there's any other pieces that you think might be helpful to make sure that the LEAPS Act is actually implemented in classrooms, or what you maybe have heard as examples of it actually working in some places.
Sure. One of the big issues in Minnesota is that the funding for K-12 education is not kept up with inflation. And written into the Minnesota Constitution is this notion of adequacy to meet state standards. And it comes from a couple of different litigations that have been levied against the state. There's something called the Skeen Standard, and also Cruz-Guzman, which have been pretty important cases that have been brought up to the level of the Supreme Court in Minnesota. English learner funding was created in 2003 in Minnesota. And there are two primary ways that English learners are funded. It's through what's called the basic EL revenue and EL concentration revenue, which is related to the percentage or proportion of English learners in your school district. That number which is a finite, that are both finite numbers, have been static or had been static for 19 years. And so you can imagine the cost of education and the cost of educating English learners continues to go up over those 19 years, but the investment at a dollars and cents level just hasn't been made. We also know that there's federal mandate that has not adequately provided states with the funding they need to meet those mandates, especially as it relates to English learners and special education students. So what's happened in Minnesota school districts is we've developed a cross-subsidy issue where districts have had to use general fund dollars to support English learners, which has created, a significant gap. Now, this last session, there were efforts made by the legislature to reduce the cross-subsidy down to zero in the next two bienniums. But we'll see how that goes. We'll see if future legislative bodies continue to honor that commitment. Even so, we don't have a clear understanding of what adequacy looks like from a funding perspective here in Minnesota, even if the cross-subsidy were to be entirely reduced in the next 4 years. And so one of the pieces that we've been pushing forward and helping to inform at MNEEP and with the EML network are what we're calling Minnesota North Star Systems Innovation Grants. Grant opportunities that are run through the Minnesota Department of Education, that flow through the department and provide school districts with opportunities to apply and propose for fully funded EL models. One of the things we've found out is that when fully funded models are present and money is not an issue, people think differently about how they program around providing supports to newcomers, dual language learners, EL students, multilingual learners, heritage learners, native language learners. So the funding piece is incredibly important. We believe at MNEEP that you have to have both policy and funding, and you have to have a strong state function in order to provide that support and hold accountable local school districts to the standard of the state law and also the standard of civil rights law, like Law v. Nichols. That's part of the civil rights legislation from the late 60s, early 70s.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And I know Leslie was nodding as well in terms of, policy, the important link between policy and funding, and appreciate you bringing up the point about adequacy. And would love to just keep learning about those grants too, as as examples of what it looks like when programs are fully funded. So thank you for that. And just a quick reminder, if you do have any questions for our panelists, feel free to add those in the Q&A. And I do have one other question that anybody could answer, because I think one piece that has been brought up in many ways, and as you were just mentioning, John, as well, is the importance of the support for educators, as well as what you were mentioning too, Leslie, about just knowing that when there is when all educators are focused on helping English learners learn, regardless of it being an EL teacher specifically, that is impactful. And so I know, we know there's an educator shortage, and especially a bilingual educator shortage. So I'm just curious what each of you have maybe been seeing around ways that might be being addressed in ways that you see as promising from your vantage point.
I can jump in quickly. We have partnered with the vice chair of the K-12 Finance Committee in the Minnesota House, as well as with the chair of the Minnesota Senate K-12 Finance Committee, and have been working to influence and inform and educate about the importance of micro-credentialing. I don't know if folks have micro-credentialing. I know that I think California's done some things with micro-credentialing. We've not done that in Minnesota. And so one of the ways we'd like to inculcate micro-credentialing is by providing opportunities for content area teachers, especially at the middle and secondary levels, to learn some of the best practices and promising practices associated with working with multilingual learners. And then also providing opportunities for ESL teachers to get a micro-credential in content area or content areas. One of the things we've seen success with in Minnesota is co-teaching and co-planned efforts around bringing together ESL and content area teachers. When I was an assistant principal and principal, we did co-planning and co-teaching, and it works well when there's, somewhat equitable knowledge and skill around how to work with students who have multilingual backgrounds, multicultural backgrounds, and also working with families in ways that are respectful, as Dr. Cuevas said, and just mutual respect about the incredible talents and creative assets that multilingual learners and families bring to school districts. We haven't gotten that legislation passed, but it's in a bill right now, and hopefully we'll get some movement on it this session.
Yeah, I can also jump in there. Our team has a whole Grow Your Own teacher program and network, which is run by my colleague Amaya Garcia. And she recently ran data about from the American Community Survey, which showed that between 2014 and 2021 cycles of the survey that were conducted, the percentage of teachers who report speaking a language other than English has remained virtually unchanged, which is about 1 in 8. And that doesn't mean that's necessarily used in the classroom either, I don't believe. And so this has happened, this kind of stagnation in the bilingual educator workforce has happened at the same time that the population of these students has continued to grow and become more diverse. So you can only think about like how it's impacting them in the classroom. And so and I don't do this work, but from what I have learned from our team is that we really need to think outside the traditional educator prep programs if we're going to start to address this issue and get more diverse teachers in the classroom, and looking at programs like Grow Your Own initiatives that draw people from the community who are really invested in these kids already. And then also making sure that all teachers are trained in supporting multilingual learners, like I mentioned before, both in service and those going through traditional teacher prep programs.
Yeah, and I think the only other thing that I have to add to what just said about that question, I think right now it's a very interesting time to be thinking about the teacher shortage and what are some creative ways that different states, because again, this is such a state and localized issue that it really does, context matters, right? I think that something that I know at least in California, and I work for my program has undergrads who are like, we have a major in education, so that's even starting that pipeline. So a lot of the conversation has been even how do we make higher ed even accessible to incoming undergraduate students, right? So it's even thinking about fixing the teacher shortage, the pipeline, even before they get to college, right? So it's a lot of doing that partnership work with high schools, middle schools, elementary schools. So what we've been doing here, again, very at the local level, we're working with local high schools that have teacher like academies. So these are like schools that are like, students that are thinking about education, and then how do we then demystify higher ed for them? So again, placing them in that pipeline and just doing some of that work. I think, again, like it was said before, a lot of that work it's really about diversifying our teacher force, which means that we need to give access to a diverse populations to take part in both traditional and non-traditional routes to teaching. Something that has been interesting to see, again, a lot of the conversation is around teacher pay, right? And is it worth becoming a teacher with the cost of college and all those cost-benefit analysis that students have to make in making decisions? And it's been interesting to see how California as a state is responding to that in giving teacher grants, like the Cal grant, like the Cal Promise grant. There's different opportunities like for loan forgiveness programs. So that's been also interesting to see how it's gonna play out in the next couple of years. And again, depending on administrations, both at state and federal level, how the role of teachers does or does not get elevated. Because I think that's something that's also been very interesting to see, the way that schools are responding to that as well.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And I think I'm going to take that. There aren't a ton of questions in the Q&A because we've covered so much ground in this time. And I think also just appreciate the multiple perspectives and how multilingualism and embracing multilingualism looks like, from the relationship level to classroom to school district to state to national level in this time has been shared and expressed on a variety of ways that multilingualism actually plays out in schools. And so I just have one last question to close us out, and that's just if each of you could share somebody who is a real life contemporary hero to you to wrap up this conversation. So if whoever wants to jump in first, but we like to end on this note for all of our talks.
I can go first, and I'm going to take a very lighthearted approach here, given the Time Magazine's announcement today. And I'm just going to say Taylor Swift. And also, I think if she really puts her mind to it, she could save democracy next year and really rally a lot of voters. And I'm just going to put that out there.
Yeah, I can go. For me, getting to know former Representative Honorable Carlos Mariani has been just an absolute pleasure and honor. He is the executive director for MNEEP, but as I mentioned, he was in the House for 32 years. I think he's probably one of the top 5 most influential politicians from a progressive perspective and from a race equity perspective Minnesota's had probably in the last half century. He's been a great friend and a great mentor, and so appreciate and have appreciated his leadership. MNEEP's mission is advancing race equity and excellence in education. And, that's not an easy task. There are a lot of forces, structures, systems that are racist in nature that are not interested in seeing race equity rise and elevate itself to the natural position of self-determination for people of color and indigenous. And so it is a liberation movement. It's a vocation. And in terms of the leadership that Carlos has demonstrated, it's definitely in that realm of like looking up to him as a hero. So thanks for asking that question. I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's always such a good question. I think maybe because we just covered her work in my class, and the way that my students responded to it was very, I don't want to say empowering, but it was very hopeful. So I would say Dr. Bettina Love. So she wrote the book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching and the Pursuit of Educational Freedom. And a lot of her work is really about how do we start from scratch, right? Like, what are the ways that we approach education through an abolitionist approach, and how we all have a role in it. So I think that, and we've also watched some of her TED Talk talking about how she used to bring hip hop into the school setting and use that as a way to teach her students physics and community building. So I think that it was really fruitful and empowering to see the way that my students who want to be future teachers respond and truly understand that approach to education. So I would definitely say I've seen her talk multiple times, and every time I'm just like, I'm ready to do the work.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for sharing. And yeah, part of why we love ending on this question is just, seeing everyone's face light up when they think of someone that inspires them and motivates them. And so thank you all so much for sharing that and all of your expertise and wisdom on this topic today. And just wanted to thank everybody who's on live right now for joining today's discussion. Like I said earlier, we'll be posting this recording on our YouTube channel, and feel free to share with anyone you think who might benefit from this conversation. And we look forward to hosting more talks in the new year, and we'll keep sending information about those through our mailing list. And just wanted to thank you all again, panelists, and thank you all for joining us. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.